Hello everybody, my name is Katrina, and thank you for coming to listen to me speak today. Before we begin, I do want to address a little elephant in the room. As you can tell, our budget was not very high this year. Now, our projector screen is not currently working, but it's okay, we can still make it work. Now, let's go ahead and begin into our first topic. During the Victorian era, clothing wasn't just about looking good or pretty. It showed other people where you ranked in society, how you were supposed to act, and your gender role. I'm going to talk about how changing fashion and beauty standards in Victorian England between 1850 to the 1900s reflected and reinforced class, gender, and economic structures, functioning as both social symbols and instruments of control. Basically, clothing in this era was never just about clothes. Think corsets so tight they could bruise your ribs, or skirts so wide they could accidentally knock over a table. They told people who you were supposed to be, what class you would belong to, and how you're supposed to act. Especially if you were a woman, it told you how society wanted you to behave. Now, let's go ahead and explore how fashion influenced people's daily life and how artists and writers responded to it. Now, why was it so important? Well, fashion became another language that said who had money, who followed gender norms, where you ranked socially, and who was worthy. Victorian era had a lot of economic change. Industrialization grew, classes, especially the middle class, grew, new expectations of respect, women judged by how they looked, clothing symbolizing modesty, and moral behavior and obedience. To understand this, I looked at a mix of primary and secondary sources. From Charles Dickens magazines to Oscar Wilde's opinions on fashion, and trust me, the Victorians had a lot to say. Charles Dickens wrote everyday pieces about Victorian life, and fashion appears all throughout them. He wasn't just describing outfits, he was using fashion to talk about class inequality, poverty, and how people tried to look respectable even when they struggled. Dickens shows how clothing shaped identity. In Fashion and Manners, Dickens makes it very clear that clothing reflected identity, morality, and class expectations. Basically, if you dressed bad, people in society were going to assume that you were poor. But if you dressed well and proper, people were instantly going to respect you. His writings basically helps us see that fashion served almost as a social filter, kind of sorting people into categories based on how they look and their appearance. So next time you're worried about looking bad at a grocery store, just be glad that you weren't a Victorian. Punch was a humorous magazine, and their fashion cartoons were gold mines. But they did make fun of women's crinolines, corsets, bustles, basically every trend at that time. But their jokes did reveal somewhat of a deeper meaning. Their jokes shamed women for following fashion. They criticized working class women for trying to look middle class, and they mocked wealthy women for spending too much. These cartoons show fashion as almost a public battleground for class and gender expectations as well. So, yes, fashion was funny, but it also kind of dictated where people belonged. So, kind of the things that people do to us now Victorian gender roles were intense. John Ruskin's lecture is one of the clearest examples of Victorian gender expectations, and he claims women are naturally pure, moral, and domestic, basically saying that they're the angel in the house kind of idea. Now, Ruskin argues women should look a certain way because of their nature. Clothes should reflect purity, delicacy, softness, and these works are important because it shows us how fashion was tied to patriarchal ideology. Now, it wasn't just about beauty, it was about keeping a woman in their place. Again, things that people like to do to the present day. I guess we can already start to see a little bit of a pattern forming. This same idea shows up in Miss Isabella Beeton's book of household management, which was written in 1861. In her book, it's basically a huge guide for middle-class women that teaches them everything from how to cook, to how to dress properly, to how to behave in public, how to manage servants, and basically be the human version of a decorative teacup. She promoted modesty, neatness, and appropriate beauty. What Beeton really does is reinforce gender roles, basically saying that women should look modest, act modest, and dress modest. They need to be able to reflect their husband's status. Her book shows fashion became a form of behavioral control, telling women exactly how they should look and act to remain respectable. These sources show how women's clothing expected them to be restrained, proper, modest, and always performing their roles as the angel of the house. So yes, corsets weren't just tight for the fashion, they were also symbolic. Here's where things get a little bit interesting, because not everybody agreed with these standards, and some writers actually challenged them. In 1885, Oscar Wilde published The Philosophy of Dress and broke away from the earlier Victorian ideas. He argues that clothing is art and people should express themselves creatively, not follow strict rules, basically saying that people shouldn't trap themselves. His writing represents a shift towards individuality and away from rigid moral control. This helps us see that by the late 1800s, fashion was starting to become a form of personal expression, not just social obligations. From 1850 to 1900s, women's silhouettes went from huge crinolines to bustles that looked like someone strapped a pillow to your backside, up to tighter, more tailored dresses, and up until the 1900s, that Gibson girl look. Now, men's fashion also changed too. They had more tailored suits, cleaner lines, and a rise in ready-made clothing because of industrialization. To help understand these transitions, I use Aileen Ribeiro's book, The Art of Dress. Even though her book focuses on 1750 through the 1820s, it does give essential background on European dress and culture that shaped Victorian ideas about modesty, elegance, and class. It basically helps explain why Victorians cared so much about their appearance. So, fashion didn't just evolve randomly. It followed economic changes, new technologies, and shifting gender expectations. My secondary sources back this up. For example, Christine Bale's course in dress culture in late Victorian women's fiction argues that clothing was tied to learning, literacy, and women's social roles. She shows how Sewing, reading, and writing were connected to how women expressed identity and gained confidence. Her work did help me out because I was able to see how fashion was kind of a quiet resistance, and it was a way for the woman to express independence even with those restrictive social rules. It was like a way for them to rebel, even just a little bit. Parker looks at how the poet Michael Field used clothing to express artistic identity and not traditional sexuality. This was important because it showed fashion wasn't always about conforming. Sometimes it was a way to push back against norms and claim self-expression. Now, what does this mean? Putting my sources together, we can see that fashion in Victorian England was signaled as a social status, meaning clothing separated the wealthy from the poor. Even a small detail signified where your status was. It was also a way to control gender norms. Women were expected to dress modestly, behave properly, and reflect masculine authority. It was a result of economic change. Industrialization created ready-made clothes, new fabrics, and new consumer markets. In conclusion, we were able to see through corsets and crinolines how changing fashion and beauty standards in Victorian England between 1850 and the 1900s reflected and reinforced class, gender, and economic structures, functioning as both a social symbols and instruments of control. Fashion in this era was not just about fabric. It was a mirror of society. And honestly, I'm glad we don't have to wear steel cages under our skirts anymore. Now, thank you for listening to my TED Talk. Goodbye. Hello,